My personal journey in this industry started with reverse engineering video games to achieve God mode, cracking the code, bypassing protections, and creating those infinite limitless possibilities that allow to win any game. I arrived at vulnerability discovery and exploit development bug bounties competitions much later in life. And because of that long journey, I really had a lot of time to reflect back on how it all works at the most fundamental and core level, as well as to reflect on how do other people typically see these things from the outside perspective, and how to explain it without dumbing down and without loss of information based on the core fundamental principles, first principles of how it works. I just opened applications to my new VIP guidance program. It's for high-level founders and execs ready to operate at a deeper level. It's not coaching, it's not training, not mentorship, it's a structural override. You will work directly with me one-on-one to rewire your cognitive operating system. That might mean entering cybersecurity, developing a hacker's mindset, or just figuring out what's going on behind the tech headlines. This is not for everyone, it's a gated opportunity. I will review a few aligned applications in June. Link in the description. There are two fundamental things that are involved in this field. One is vulnerability in the code, and another one is the exploits. Vulnerability and exploit are kind of like bread and butter, better together, but also we know that the production workflows and tool sets and skill sets that are involved in producing these two different things, bread and butter, are different. If you want to optimize your productivity, then it makes sense to focus on something, on just one part, either vulnerability discovery or exploit development. I will come back to the difference between vulnerabilities and exploits in a moment. Meanwhile, to clarify about what is a zero-day. Zero-day is an unpatched vulnerability for which the patch doesn't exist. This is one side that is more or less obvious. Another aspect of the zero-day, which is more important, is that it is a type of vulnerability that has certain impact. For example, if you have some command line utility that you wrote yourself and that isn't exposed to the internet, it's not connected to anything valuable behind it, technically you can find some buffer overflow, and technically it will be a security vulnerability, but it's not really a zero-day because the impact of exploiting this bug is negligible, and nobody will pay you for that. There is no bug bounty program, there is no third-party broker that can buy it from you, which is why this kind of vulnerabilities are usually not called zero-days. Zero-day is specifically a powerful and impactful security vulnerability. From a broader perspective, there is this big field of bugs in the code. A bug may or may not be security issue, it can be just bug. Then there is a smaller subset of bugs that we call security vulnerabilities. They are the bugs that can be manipulated to achieve the attacker's objectives. And then there is an even smaller subset of security vulnerabilities that we call zero-days. And because of this powerful aspect of zero-days, typically you would hear them in relation to the attacks in the wild that are already happening, and some systems were compromised, it gets in the news. So this distinction is important. I will focus primarily on zero-days in this smaller subset of the security bugs, not just that you can write an exploit for them, but also that an exploit will be impactful. Now I'm coming back to the difference between the vulnerability and exploit from the production perspective. There are many, many things that are different. Basically, the workflow of creating a vulnerability and creating the exploit is totally different. They reuse some skills. There is an overlap in skills and tools that you would be using. For example, low-level debugger, reverse engineering, understanding how code works. But aside from that, the workflow for producing vulnerabilities and exploits are totally different. What is most important is how they challenge you in the process. The type of challenge that you encounter when finding vulnerabilities is of a more general nature with respect to how human brain operates, and it is actually deeper. When you are finding 0 days, you have to face a lot of uncertainty. You never know what do you have to do, what your next step should be. The biggest challenge in vulnerability discovery is facing uncertainty, facing lack of information, and being able to figure out your own way through it. And then also there are secondary challenges, like you have to be able to think out of the box and discover novel things, novel solutions to the problem, find out attack vectors that nobody thought about. That is probably the core challenge with 0 days. When it comes to exploit development is actually much closer to classic engineering how we know it. Except that in classic engineering, we're kind of given a framework, theoretical frameworks, conceptual frameworks, as well as basic primitives and tool sets that allow us to actually accomplish the engineering process. While in the process of exploit engineering, you do not have these basic primitives typically, and you do not have these theoretical frameworks and conceptual frameworks. So part of this engineering process in exploit development is specifically establishing the fundamental framework for developing the exploit and building up the fundamental primitives for that. Vulnerabilities are different from the perspective of exploit development. Some of them are very easy to exploit, which is most of the write-ups that you can find on the internet. There are types of vulnerabilities that have very easy solutions in terms of exploit development, like stack buffer overflows and most classes of heap buffer overflows. In these scenarios, you can have a very strong fundamental framework that you can simply take in from the public information and use it to build up, to engineer the final product. But in the more complex and advanced cases, there exist types of vulnerabilities where neither there exists a theoretical framework nor any basic primitives that you can take and copy-paste from some public source. The main thing about what makes exploit development challenging is the requirement to build up your own primitives, and specifically to think in a way where you not just copy-paste another person's knowledge, but you develop your own knowledge. So why it is important, now that I have explained the fundamental challenge of vulnerability discovery and exploit development, they stress different aspects of the limits of the human brain, which means that probably you don't want to stress both at the same time. The best way to go would be to take one aspect, one side, either vulnerability discovery or exploit development, and focus on it for a while. The reason why advanced bug bounty programs and competitions, they pay more, specifically because it is so difficult to connect these two sides, stress different weaknesses in the human brain. Typically, the better idea would be to start with exploit development for a known vulnerability to build up the skills. Honestly speaking, exploit development is much less stressful. Personally, as I reflect on how I did it, because there is less uncertainty. If you already have the bug, all you have to do is apply engineering for it. Yeah, sure, it's not trivial engineering, but it's still engineering, and you don't have uncertainty aspect. I'm sure that I mentioned already that human brains hate uncertainty. It's like the enemy number one. So 0 days are kind of harder. You shouldn't expect that there is a magic button like a magic fuzzer program that you can run and find 0 days. I will talk about this in the second part of the video. For now, I just want to say that 0 days are not easy to discover for the valuable kind of target which pay what you expect from 0 days. So the next thing that I want to talk about is media coverage. Sadly, there's a lot of confusion from my perspective as an expert and as a first-hand developer. I see so many incorrect statements and confusion and incomplete coverage, and overall, based on the small amount of information that is being disclosed, it's being twisted, distorted, and then blew out of proportion so that it seems like you're dealing with some sort of monster. And from an expert perspective, it's just it just doesn't make sense at all. So I try in my free time to shine some light on 0 days when I have an extra moment to look at these things. I comment in my Twitter usually, not always, and I highlight specifically the things that are either misrepresented or not covered at all in the media coverage. What you read in the press about 0 days and exploits is usually has nothing to do with reality. For example, looking at the recent coverage of 0 days in browsers, I often see that a software vendor only discloses part of the exploit chain, because for complex software like browsers, typically we need several vulnerabilities chained together in the exploit to achieve the compromise. And when a 0 day gets disclosed, the software vendor, has to patch both or all the vulnerabilities involved in the attack as soon as possible. Otherwise, they're kind of exposing their own users to make them easy targets for somebody who can recreate the exploit based on the vulnerabilities that were highlighted. So typically they try to patch all the bugs involved as soon as possible. And what I see occasionally, and quite often actually, is that only one part of the vulnerability chain would be patched by the software vendor. Most probably this happens in situations when the attack is relatively low impact. For example, when the attack is ultra narrow, targeting just a small, maybe just a few people, few persons somewhere, and then when the attack targets older versions of software in which one or more vulnerabilities involved in the chain were already kind of patched previously in the newer version of the software. So this kind of attack obviously has a very low impact because most of the users would be already patched and unaffected by it, but still it gets into the press because the vendor issued this out-of-bound update and everybody gets nervous. The next thing that I have to address is detection of 0 day attacks and 0 day exploits. It is not possible to guarantee detection of a 0 day attack by definition because the 0 day attack is previously unknown. In order to understand the situation about detection of 0 days, the best way is to apply systems thinking, because empirical kind of thinking is always limited. Like, you can have a defense that shows a certain statistics of detection, but it only works until it gets broken, until the statistics becomes incorrect, right? And from the systematic perspective, there are two aspects that are worth considering. So one aspect of the systematic thinking is the nature of the problem, which is that 0 days cannot be detected by design, by the nature. And another side is the structure of the 0 day attack. So a 0 day attack consists of separate parts. First is you need this vulnerability, 0 day vulnerability. You build an exploit on top of the vulnerability, which is the second thing. Then you will build up a payload, some meaningful code or Trojan rootkit, which actually accomplishes what you need to accomplish in the system and ensures persistence. And then you will also have supplemental parts of the attack, like you will have some communications to extract information from the compromised system, for instance. And these are the 4 parts of the zero-day attack, which can be addressed separately at the protection level. And that is what many protections do. How most protections work is they have to detect patterns. Patterns in communication, detecting some unusual traffic, patterns inside of the operating system, detecting some unusual API calls, some unusual code injections, which just commonly happens when you have a Trojan, detecting some discrepancies on the file system, which happens when you have Trojan implanted on the system. Then there can be patterns in the exploit itself, but at this part of the chain, it's already much harder to detect. And then there can be patterns in the vulnerability, and at this part of the chain, at the root level, it's already hard to detect because vulnerabilities are very different. And most of them would be novel, and the vulnerability trigger can be made novel, can be made undetectable by virtue of avoiding any sort of patterns around it. Most protections that try to address this exploit problem, the zero-day attack problem, will try to address later stages of the exploit chain, specifically detecting communications and detecting some unusual activity inside the system. These parts of the attack are often reused. For example, Trojan can be obtained somewhere, downloaded from the black forums or bought from somebody else, and once it has been compromised, detected, it's blown up. And anybody else who tries to reuse the same Trojan, the attack will be detected, caught by even the simplest kind of system. Which is why most of the attacks will be caught either by the Trojan or by the communication that it produces. But the zero-day itself, the zero-day vulnerability and the exploit, these 2 parts are extremely hard to detect because it is easy to evade patterns at this level. Professional exploit developers understand very well how exploit detections work, and they know how to evade them, and they know how to trigger them. In many situations, a beginner exploit developer will be reusing the code from some public repo, which will make the exploit very easily detectable by even a low-grade protection, simply because the patterns are already out there and the protection had those patterns. On the other hand, a more advanced exploit developer would have a choice whether they want to burn their exploits by getting it to be detected, or whether they want to make it work as long as possible for many years. As somebody who works with these things on a technical level, I can say that it is more or less straightforward to make a vulnerability and exploit undetectable by avoiding any sort of patterns. And obviously, we're not talking here only about the patterns that were published on some GitHub repos, but also there exists a more general type of patterns, that more abstract type of patterns that technically they are not laying out as a piece of code on GitHub, but smart protection would catch them. Vulnerability here is the hardest aspect of the whole chain to avoid detection, because typically a vulnerability has either a trigger code or a trigger piece of data. And in many situations, this piece of data is kind of fixed. So it's not really easy to mutate it, but it's also possible in many situations, because a vulnerability in code can be reached from different directions, so to say. And that is how vulnerability detection can be subverted. Even if you have a bug that is already well known by pattern, and you know that it will be caught by some detection, you can still manipulate the trigger of this vulnerability in such a way that it will avoid detection. The last thing that I have to talk about is to how to actually protect yourself from zero days. Usually when there is this media publication, an outbreak of a zero-day attack, a lot of people start asking on Reddit, on some other social media, if it's bad enough. If you even ask this kind of question, whether or not a particular incident is critical enough to patch your systems, you're already in much bigger trouble than you can get from 0 days. Because if your system is unpatched, it can be hacked with a non-zero-day exploit, like one of those things that can be literally published on the internet because nobody pays for them, and your system can be hacked with one of these. If you're even asking this question, if you're considering this, you have to really go back to the basics and restructure the whole defense strategy. If you are the one who will be responsible for the compromise, do what it takes to keep your systems patched. That's it. It will eliminate majority of ransomware attacks. The mentality of a ransomware attacker is attack the weakest link. If you have a system that is unpatched, nobody will send you a 0-day. It will be hacked through a well-known vulnerability, through some exploit that is published on the internet. And then once you have patched systems, once you have hardened systems, then you can start thinking about whether or not some particular 0-day affects you. So how to actually protect yourself? The only real solution to this problem is understanding how these things work on all possible levels. Because once you understand how these attacks work, all the other actions and actionable items will follow naturally. To learn how it works, you can read something on the internet, but be aware that not all of it is true. So the best way, I think, is to try and do something yourself, find some vulnerabilities, write some exploits. This way you can build up immediate hands-on experience, start understanding how it works. The next thing that you can do is assume compromise. Now, if you have this kind of system which you cannot hide it, you cannot conceal it, you cannot take it off from the internet, assume that your system has been already compromised and execute the necessary arrangements, policies, actions to contain the compromise. When you assume that the system has been already compromised, you think differently about the problem. And you start discovering ways of protecting your assets in a more realistic way. You stop playing with so-called risk management and hoping that the system is not broken, but rather you kind of embrace it as a possibility and contain the damage beforehand. In cybersecurity, the risk management approach is very popular. I just want to warn you against it, especially with 0-days. There are so many unknowns involved. Basically, you cannot predict anything. This field is very closed off. You do not know the quantifiable aspects of the risk, which means that you cannot build a solid risk management strategy. Most of risk strategy management is basically, it's a business which thrives on the fact that the problem remains unsolved. And so don't do risk management, eliminate risks.